Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to do a story from Time Is, Time Was, Time Will Be, the third book in the Time Is series. A while back we told how Scott, Don, and Honey went back to Grist Mill Fields and their experiences to try and rebuild the Grist Mill Field in their own time. Well, this is at where they talk about Grist Mill Field again and go back to try and make some changes. And you'll see why in a moment here. I'm going to have to read two chapters. The first chapter is To Change or Not to Change. The quote, I like to start these with quotes. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. That's by Robert Frost. So today is a day for the guild meeting. Everyone showed up on time, and we had a great surprise. Frank stopped off and got a big order of teriyaki and fried chicken with biscuits and corn on the cob. It helps to keep the meetings mellow when everyone is well fed. Scott kept trying to bring the meeting to order, but to no avail until all the chicken was gone. Scott rose from his seat and finally brought the meeting to order. Now that everyone has feasted, we have some news to give you before we discuss future trips. He turned to Frances. How long have we had the apple tree outside? She tilted her head to the side, perplexed. I guess as long as before I got here. Scott turned to Frank. Same question, Frank. I don't know. Guess it's been here as long as you. Cindy chimed in. What's the deal? It's been here a long time. Why are you asking about the apple tree? Scott sat down and leaned back in his chair. From out of a folder, he placed a bunch of pictures of the field onto the table. These all had a date, timestamp on them. These pictures were taken after our last meeting. I went back 7 years and planted this tree. This lab was time shielded, and all the information in it has been locked from that point. What that means is that any changes from that point on will be identifiable. Scott pointed to me to pick up the thread. I passed out the report I had written and gave everyone a chance to look through it. Basically, my report is that Honey and I went to 1944 Connecticut to see a circus that was simply a pleasure trip. Well, there a fire broke out. We saved a little girl who happened to have been left with us while the mother and brother went to the bathroom. We reunited the mother and daughter at the hospital and came home. Once here, we looked up the fire in our reference books. In the original history, both the girl and her brother died. Now, only the brother. What happened was unintentional. We know about the change due to the time lock on the lab. Scott rose again. Frances set us on the correct path. I thought and truly believed that time was immutable. I'm afraid I was wrong. We have all taken trips which had varying degrees of possible influence on people and the environment. We remember everything as it is, or as it should be, because any action that changes is changed in our minds through collective conscience and the fact that we have been a part of that change. The fact that we can differentiate realities through the time lock shows that time is still a singular and we are not part of a divergent time branch. Sandy interrupted. So what you're saying is that time can be changed, that we can coordinate our actions and work towards a better world. Scott looked solemnly at her. Sandy, the possibility for those actions is viable, but we have to decide if it is advisable. Sandy was aghast. Of course it's advisable. Look at all the pain and suffering we can eliminate. Look at the lives that could be saved. Frank spoke up. And what about the other lives that are lost in the process? Who are we to judge who lives and who dies? Wilford looked up. Does this mean the trips are over? Scott looked at him and Frances. I think that is something we have to decide. There are repercussions with every trip, large and small. Now we know that there are inherent risks where before we assumed that there were none. I'll give you a few moments to think about this, and then we can recommence. Everyone broke up. Sandy and Frank were arguing about making drastic changes. Wilford and Frances went outside and sat on the stoop. Scott and I held our own conference, and Honey wandered around listening in. Don, I'm not sure what to do. I never thought things would come to this point. I was so sure we couldn't do any harm, and now I'm not sure of anything. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in Scott's eyes. I thought a bit. Well, what if we take a minor event, change it, and then see what repercussions? See the repercussions. Something simple with a minimal amount of people involved. We do it so it is recent enough that what changes occur are minimal, but identifiable, so it can be put right if things go south. Scott shook his head. If we can control things as simply as that, we should go back farther and have plenty of time to see the progression. By the time we had finished talking, everyone was seated again. Scott opened the floor. Sandy rose first. I think we should do something, but I'm not sure what. We have the tools to make the world much better than the one we're in. I get that whatever we change will affect plenty of people. The question is, where do we start? Wilfred stood up. I'm the last person to be saying this, considering what I've done. Harry and Francis looked deeply at each other. However, intentionally messing with people's lives seems to be overreaching our authority. They say for every action is an equal but opposite reaction. For every positive thing we attempt, I fear a greater negative result. Frank was in agreement with him. Look, I'm no scientist or theorist. I'm just a cook. I can't see where just because we can change things, we should. I don't think we should stop traveling because there's so much we can learn and set the record straight on. So I say we keep on traveling, learning, but do it without harm and carefully. I'm leaning forward. I want to try and change something. We know it can be done, and with care I can see possibilities. She turned to Scott and to me. You both were talking just now about taking an event that had minimal impact, one that could be put right simply if things didn't work the way we thought they would. It seems that would be perfect. We must know if a simple change snowballs into something drastic. I don't know, what if maybe we tried something here? Maybe prevent the mill from blowing up and see what happens. If we tied it off tighter or clamped the rope, we could see the difference it made, and with the time in between, we could have the long-term view as well. I looked around, saw people nodding. We could do this carefully, view time progressively. Then if things started going out of the hand, we'd go back and let the flower fly. The best part is that if we do go back to let the mill explode, no one gets hurt. Scott rose. Folks, it has been suggested that we try this with what's at our door. We see what would have happened if the village had remained intact. All in agreement? Everyone raised their hands. Scott turned to me. Don, we're going to need to hook up a few more desk units and televisions. Everyone can watch as we go through a series of years and annotate good and bad aspects. How long will it take you to set up the station for everyone? I gave it some thought. I can have stations set up close. I close the business tomorrow. It will take me a week at least to duplicate the program and branch connect as separate units for everyone. This is going to need a lot more power and will mean adding about 16% more batteries plus tying into the generator in the barn. Else we'll make another one for the roof here. Give me until next Wednesday and I should have this set up. It would be a lot faster if I had some help from you, Scott. Scott looked a little sheepish. Tell you what, give me a couple of days back home with Livia. I promise to be back in 3 days to help with separation and setup. Will that be all right? I nodded. That's all anyone has to say then. Meeting adjourned until Thursday next week. Everyone left except Frances, who had hung behind and was wringing her handkerchief and tearing up. Honey and I sat on either side of her. Frances, what's worrying you? She looked up and spoke to Honey. I met Wilfred after I left. With the village not being destroyed, I won't be leaving and won't meet Wilfred, and I won't be here, will I? She was breathing heavily and looked like she was having an anxiety attack. We had forgotten how this might impact her and not asked her opinion. Honey looked at me. Don? Well, the ball was in my court, and I had nobody to pass to. Francis, you will be here in the time bubble. While in it, you will be safe and not affected. I'm taking a leap here, but I very much believe past the juncture point where you originally left and went to town, there will be two Francises. She looked at me with wide eyes. And when we removed the bubble, I felt a cold chill down my spine. To the best of my knowledge, you will remain, but without the knowledge your other self will have. From that point, you will be two separate people in two separate times without the collective conscience. She got up and left to go back to the village. Honey sat down on the other side of the table. Down, you sounded sure, but I know you well enough by now to know when you're not. Well, honey, I'm as sure as it's possible to be that she won't be affected. You see the problem, though, we're going to make changes affecting people's lives. The major change being that they will remain in locus and continue from that then. I pointed to the village outside. What will be the effect of a few hundred years if that grows? Will this field still remain for Scott to buy? We may be affected in some way as well. Honey, I wish I had more answers, but without more data, I'm assuming a hell of a lot. We agreed to try this, and I'm going to begin now. Honey went over to our book of plans and found the ones for our desk controller. I'll place an order with electronic services, number unit 16, for the components you need, and order them for pickup or delivery tomorrow. You can start making the boards for separation. I ordered dinner to be sent in and started laying out parts. Each board received a separate identifier for isolation. Then I realized that this was going to be too big of a project to be added to the main unit. I had to create a mini unit set up as a link to the main and also self-sustaining. I used the main viewer program with shunts to separate between the units. Dinner arrived and we ate while working. Honey laid out the components we had already in stock and began making a few of the control boards. We quit around midnight and woke up early, breakfasted, and in the lab by 0800. Electronic Services sent a delivery van with all Honey had ordered, but we shelved everything. For the next 2 days, we tackled setting up the lab in its new configuration. On the third day, Scott arrived and started tackling the program duplication while I made the new generator and installed the battery plates. Today is Tuesday, the day before our great experiment. We selected a couple of the horses that hadn't been out for a run recently and went out to the woods. Wilfred and Francis joined us when they saw us head across the road to the wooded area. For a while, we let the horses wander while we talked. Wilfred was in the saddle and Francis behind him, her head resting on his back. Wilfred came alongside of me and we dropped back behind the others. I looked him over. Apparently Francis must be a good cook as he is starting to develop a belly even with the hard work of keeping the village in shape. Don, he began, and looked at me imploringly. Don't let anything happen to Francis. I suddenly realized how deep his love for her was. I promise that with the time lock on, she'll be safe. I sounded more confident than I felt and wish I could have been sure in my own mind. We rode until evening set in and ended up at the village. We all took cabins for the night and spent the rest of the evening playing music and dancing. We were all headed to bed when Scott stood outside his cabin and played taps on his harmonica. When he was done, there was a moment of silence. We all said good night and went to bed. I got up early and went into the kitchen to start breakfast. I milked the cows and picked the eggs and then cut some bacon for frying. I was setting the bacon in the warmer when Wilfred and Francis came in and started cutting potatoes. They took what they had and cut and fried them in the grease from the bacon. I watched with amusement as they sang and bumped tips in rhythm while they were cooking. I started cracking enough eggs for everyone. I was going to put the rest of the eggs in the fridge when Francis stopped me and told me to leave them in the basket. If you don't wash them off, they're okay to leave outside the fridge. When I put the potatoes in the warmer, I made scrambled eggs and put those in the warmer, adding some cheese on top. Francis and Wilfred had cut up a loaf of bread and put that on the table with butter and marmalade. Honey came in and made some coffee, and then Scott came in and set the table. We all got the food out of the warmer and set it on the table. We didn't talk much, which was unusual, especially for Scott. I did ask what they did with the extra eggs, though. They had a stand that they had put by the road with a large cooler loaded with the eggs. People came by and put money in the drop box, which they collected every evening. We don't make more than about 100 a day, but honestly, I don't care if they pay or not. We have more than we need when there aren't customers here. I suggested they get with Mac about donating some to the shelter. We ate and cleaned up quickly, then rode to the lab. After getting the horses fed and watered and new hay in the stalls, we were ready to begin. Frank and Sandy were at the lab before us, drinking coffee and fiddling with the controllers. We instructed Wilfred and Francis on how to use the controllers and then had them do a run-through on the village in the present time. We all did a function check, and I went to the primary panel, which was tied into the pad on the portal. This was much larger and had readouts on power and battery levels, as well as a readout on all the subsystems. We could cut in or out the control panels and make changes to prevent an overload. Everyone's function checks were good, and they all flipped the switch that told ready. My board showed all green. I set the TCVTD to 1804. The time was 3 minutes from drop, and the portal was set to open inside the mill. I activated, and the lights in the lab dimmed as the time lock initiated, and a second after, the portal opened. Frank, Sandy, Wilfred, Honey, and I walked through and raised the pallet higher. We used the excess rope to fasten it in place more securely. We went back and then began the process of seeing what change this would bring. Everyone had an area to cover so we could follow individual groups. I noticed that Wilfred was holding Francis very tightly. The party in the field continued, and everyone was having a good time. Scott was zeroed in on his cabin and saw Fess's head down into the basement. He zoomed in and followed him. Fess had a metal box that he was burying. Before he set it in the hole, he opened it. We saw the money and jewelry that we had found there. Frances gasped when she saw her brooch and muttered, "You effing bastard," under her breath. It was all the more amusing because she never swore. She reached up and touched it on her shirt. Honey had the party on her screen and saw Zeke and another man walk towards the meeting hall. They were just passing the cabin when Fess came out and was going to his horse. Zeke and the man swung around as the horse neighed. Fess swung his rifle from the saddle. Zeke and the man with him pulled their revolvers. All three fired almost the same time. I saw Fess drop backwards from the two shots. Zeke stood there shaking his head as he looked at Fess's body. With alarm, I saw a dark color stain Zeke's shirt. He suddenly crumpled as the man leaped to catch him. We watched as folks came running at the sound of the reports and gathered around Zeke's still form. Fess's body was unceremoniously dumped outside the fence line for the wolves and coyotes to take care of. Zeke was brought into the meeting room and laid out and stayed as a coffin was brought from the general store and a grave dug. We stood as Zeke was placed in his coffin and carried by 6 men to the grave site. Frances led the coffin, playing Amazing Grace on her harmonica. It gave me a shudder to see her there and also here. I saw that she had tears in her eyes as she watched the procession. Well, we all did. Scott quietly suggested we move ahead 5 years. In 5 years, the village had grown to include the 10 more cabins and the blacksmith shop. Fess's cabin had been boarded up and was not used. At the back, where the animals were, was another well and a lot more animals. Another 5 years and there was more growth. A tavern had been added and a fashionable hotel. We watched as travelers came and went. A lot of people went in and out of the meeting hall. Wilfred zoomed in to see a small gambling area that had been set up. Folks were playing roulette, faro, poker, and pachinko. At the edge of the gambling was a small bar. A jail was now in place nearby, and we saw a sheriff and deputy seated outside playing cards. Another 5 years, the wooded area across the road was being cleared and a larger wheat field was being farmed. Houses were more plentiful and the village was now composed of the tavern two gambling houses, the hotel we had seen before, as well as a newer one. It was now a larger general store. It seemed to be spreading lengthwise, and a road now stood where the animals had been. The animals had been moved to the opposite side of the road and were comprised of 20 beef cows and 30 pigs, and I couldn't count the number of hens. We saw Francis and several others rushing around taking care of the customers. The man they had voted as a replacement for Zeke was now mayor and was a wealthy man. Many of the others were not so fortunate. I looked over at everyone and saw the same despair at the sequence of events we were seeing. Let's go ahead 30 years, Scott suggested. I hesitated. I didn't want to see more and was eager to go back and set things right. But I saw everyone looking at me and nodding their heads to go forward. 30 more years and what had been a village was now a city. The field we were on was still there, but as a lot, not a field. The city had continued to spread lengthwise and was quite extensive. The year was about 1860. A railroad depot was now nearby, and the city reminded me of a mini Reno, Nevada. The jail had grown much larger, which I took to mean they had more reasons for having one. There was a police department instead of a sheriff's office. Lots of stores were in evidence, and a small area where the field had been was made into a recreation of the original village. We zoomed in on it and saw many of the original inhabitants there. They looked miserable. Scott located Frances, and I would rather not describe the woman she had become. Suffice it to say that she was very unhappy. It made all our hearts ache to see her. I glanced over and saw Wilfred with his arm around her, holding her close. We had been signing so long we jumped when Sandy exploded. Let's go back and blow the damn mill up. We all agreed, but Frank asked us to wait a second. He went over and opened the door and went outside. We all followed. The sight that met our eyes made me want to throw up. The lab was now gated, but with massive holes, and was covered on the outside in graffiti. Broken bottles and papers littered the sidewalks. Behind us, I could see our home with boarded windows and an iron door. One wall was burnt from the outside. Derelict buildings were nearby, and the only ones in decent repair were the liquor stores and pawn shops. Down the street, we could see the tall signs of the casinos. There was no grass, and what few trees there were fighting a losing battle. Across from us was a pawn shop doing brisk business, and next to that were 3 bail bond offices. Next door were several small, disreputable, cheap motels offering hourly rates. A shot rang out from the liquor store as a person came running out and towards us with the clerk or owner fast on their heels, shooting as he went. We turned and rushed to get inside when Wolf spun with a bullet in his shoulder. One hit my legs and a ricochet landed one in Honey's leg. Sandy was cursing as she flung herself over Honey, and Frank covered Wolf and Francis, while I covered Honey and Sandy. The robber dove into our area as a liquor store owner. Having reloaded, took aim and fired a shot into the robber's head not 5 feet from where we were. He casually made a call on his cell phone as he walked back to the store. I carried Honey inside and Frank carried Wolf. Sandy began doing first aid as I quickly tied off a bandage onto my shoulder, and Scott and I worked to get things set right. Sandy reiterated, "Blow the damn thing to kingdom come. Come on, let's get things back." The work of first aid continued as we all went back and bathed and sat at our stations. I was set to seconds after we had made our changes, and I opened the portal. I handed Sandy a knife, and she went through and cut the cord to the point a handful of strands were holding it. We watched as she dove back in. The portal closed, and we watched as the pellet plummeted. I zoomed out and up, and we saw the explosion replay as it had before. Scarcely had the explosion started when Will ran outside. He came in eating an apple and grinning. I was happy to see that all the wounds spontaneously healed as the corrected time overlaid the present. I shut down everything, and we all sat emotionally exhausted. I made a motion that we all retire to the diner for dinner. The motion was seconded, and we adjourned. So that's their first time travel trip where they actually tried to change things. There's other ones, and we'll probably read those at a later time. The next reading I'm going to be doing is going to be from, which one? What am I going to read from? Legend of Creation. Let's do Legend of Creation again. And we'll do a reading after that from Joe's Journey. We'll kind of see what happens when he finds a lottery ticket. So 2 more readings coming up. I do apologize. There was a slight gap in the readings, but that was unavoidable. But we'll have them a little more regularly now. And I thank you for visiting, and thank you. Hopefully you'll be here for our next reading within a few days. So thanks again, and see you next time.